Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending today's event, which is on the crucial topic of how do we pay for a Green New Deal. My name is Aiden Dikadem, and I'm an organizer for the New Economics Foundation. So welcome and thank you for joining us. So I guess, this event couldn't be better timed, really. On Wednesday, we got from the Chancellor a budget that mentioned cider more times than it mentioned the climate change. And ahead of us, we've got COP26 in Glasgow, which has been described as the make or break summit. The stakes are really high at the moment. And our political opponents have shifted their tactics. So for decades, we've had to deal with the well-funded reckon strategy of climate change denialism and the discrediting of science. And now it's framed in terms of cost. Can we afford to make the changes we need to? Will this cost the taxpayer too much? And it's precisely these attacks that today's discussion will be addressing. If we need a Green New Deal to avoid climate catastrophe, what would it actually look like? What role can financial institutions, including banks, play in funding it? Who is standing in the way of progress, and what can we do about it? So we're lucky to be joined by some amazing speakers tonight, and they'll be talking one after another, and then we'll take questions at the end. So please, while they're talking, if a question comes to mind, post it in the chat and post it throughout so that we can collate them at the end. So just to sort of run you through the speakers, we're first going to be hearing from the brilliant Frank van Lerven, who's a senior economist at the New Economics Foundation. And he'll give us some political context and speak to his new paper on moving away from fiscal rules. And then we'll hear from Katie Kedward, who is a policy fellow at UCL Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose. And she'll be discussing the role of central banks in funding a Green New Deal. We'll then hear from Laurie Macfarlane, who is the economics editor at Open Democracy, and he'll offer some of the sort of transformative options we have available to us if we can find the political will. And finally, I'm afraid Grace Blakely couldn't make it tonight, but we're lucky to have the brilliant Sara Murawski, who is a policy advisor at the Sustainable Finance Lab. Some kind of housekeeping stuff. If you're on social media, please remember to tweet with the hashtag NEF briefing during the event. And again, post your questions throughout if the moment they come into your head, so we can collate them all at the end, and then we'll have questions. So with no further ado, I'll pass it over to Frank. Thank you so much for joining.
Hi there, can I just check that you can see my screen?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, great, cool. So welcome to How to Pay for a Green New Deal. I just wanted to give some very quick context on what we saw in the UK budget yesterday. So as Aiden had rightly said, climate change, but also environment, biodiversity loss were not mentioned once in the Chancellor's budget speech. Climate and environmental spending were actually woefully inadequate in terms of what we would want to see to reach the goals of the green transition. We're seeing about 24 billion invested over the next 3 to 4 years, when actually we need about 30 billion each year in terms of the climate aspirations. So the point of my presentation will be that we're kind of missing a significant opportunity for a green social justice recovery. And just to put some things into context, yesterday we saw that basically there was a lot of talk about how in the next year we're going to be kind of at the top of the G7 in terms of growth. But if you look over the next 5 years, actually the UK's projections are going to be 3% less than what it was pre-COVID. So actually COVID will have hit us the hardest over the long term. At the same time, average earnings are still not set to recover to 2008 levels until the end of the latest forecast. So we're going to basically go 19 years without an overall increase in average earnings. That wasn't discussed at all in the budget. So woefully inadequate in terms of people's standards of living. And we're going to have to wait until 2027 until we actually see an increase in earnings compared to what they were in 2008. Alongside this, we saw the targets for borrowing to basically the Chancellor's decided that he wants to reduce the level of borrowing and even reduce it compared to what the forecasts were in March. So in March, public borrowing was actually 6% of GDP higher than it is this forecast. And instead of having borrowing towards 2024, 2025, 2026 at 3%, we've dropped to 1.7, 1.7, and 1.5%. At the same time, we're also targeting a lower overall public sector net debt level. It was supposed to be about 103% by 2025, but now that's looking at, they're targeting a 92% overall debt level. So effectively what we have is economic scoring of about 2 to 3%, borrowing set to be smaller by 6 to 7% in 2025. But what we need to prevent this economic scarring is higher employment and falling wages. We needed about a 90 billion fiscal stimulus. That's a bit basically to kind of reach the Biden stimulus. They've in terms of comparisons to us, they've invested 70 billion more than we have. So we would need about a 70 billion funding gap, and that could all be invested in the green transition to pay for a Green New Deal. Now, why don't we want to kind of pay, make that type of investment? And it's often the argument that we can't afford it. But if you look at interest payments, that's the amount of costs to borrow, they're actually at all-time lows. So when you just think about it in terms of taxation, only about 6%, there's basically 6% of taxation goes to interest payments. And that's an all-time historical low. If we look at debt servicing costs, also, despite all these forecasts about inflation and possibly inflation increasing the cost of servicing debt and that increasing, so we shouldn't borrow, they're also still forecasted to be at all-time lows. And this isn't just a trend in the UK, it's an international trend. And what's interesting is actually Chancellor Sunak started his speech by saying, the more you borrow, the higher your debt servicing costs, or the higher your interest rate. And what we saw and what we've seen over the last 30 years is actually the complete opposite, both in the UK and internationally. If you look at this chart, the blue line is debt levels going up and interest rates, the red line, falling. So basically there's something that's counteracting that narrative. And here's a chart in the UK, which basically shows exactly the same thing. The UK debt levels have risen, but interest rates have been falling. Now, this is again another chart that just shows borrowing is not necessarily correlated with longer term interest rates. If that was the case, this chart would basically be downward sloping. The more the government would borrow, the higher the interest rate. One reason this happens to be is because we have very weak indicators of fiscal space, but we also neglect the role of the Bank of England. And the fact that the Bank of England right now owns about 36% of government debt. And in fact, what you don't hear in the news very often is that about 99.5% of all COVID debt has been matched by the Bank of England's money printing program. And basically what the Bank of England's money printing program does is it replaces long-term, what they call liabilities or debt, and replaces it with shorter-term liabilities that are lower, that basically have lower interest levels on them. So what we've effectively done is we replace these long-term liabilities that are high in interest with short-term liabilities that are low in interest. And by doing that, we've managed to reduce the government's debt servicing costs. And so if we return to that figure, instead of interest payments falling to about 6% of taxation, they're actually 4.7% when you consider the Bank of England. So they're even lower than what we thought in terms of historical lows. Now, so while debt and borrowing levels aren't really correlated with government's debt levels, while interest payments aren't correlated with borrowing or debt levels, what we do also see is that they are actually correlated with the Bank of England's interest rate and its money printing programs. So the point that I really want to make here is that the Bank of England has significant influence over the cost of debt. It can issue money to help pay for some of the things that we need most in society, as we saw with the pandemic, and therefore there's this hugely big concern over the debt levels and the borrowing levels might be misplaced, and there's a lot to do with the Bank of England, which I think Katie will talk more about. But my point here is that the Bank of England can help target lower interest rates over the long term to keep debt servicing costs low and manageable. and so that we can pay for a Green New Deal. This is something that we've basically talked about in our paper, Calling Time, replacing the fiscal rules with fiscal referees that just came out earlier last week. And effectively what we suggest is that you replace the current standards of managing fiscal policy with a set of fiscal principles. And I'm not going to get into this all now. I encourage you I'll put the link in the chat box because I'm coming to an end now. But I just wanted to say, obviously, we can't print as much money and go kind of willy-nilly on the Bank of England. But the whole point of our paper is that the way we think about how we use the government's borrowing capacity, how the Bank of England works with the government is kind of fundamentally misplaced. And that we can borrow a lot more, and there's a lot more fiscal space available. We just have to match that with the productive capacity of the economy. And once you bring the economy back to its capacity, once you have people on high wages and there's no levels of employment but high wages, then you can start thinking about taxing. But until that point, the constraints on fiscal space and on borrowing are very low, and we have a lot more to do and space that we can do with that. And what we should be doing right now is making those climate investments in line for the Green New Deal and creating those well-paid green jobs. Stop deficit fetishizing and kind of worrying so much about debt levels, and start thinking about outcomes and the goals of the planet that we need in the future. That's it. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Frank. And I think, yeah, the focus on basically very stringent and narrow focus from the Treasury is partly why we're in this mess, because they're not measuring the things that are actually important, including the kind of health of the economy that you were talking about. The next speaker we are going to hear from is Katie. So I'll just pass it straight over to you and take it away.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me for this great event, and it's great to see your presentation, Frank. I guess what I'm going to say is going to complement it quite well. I'm going to mostly be talking about the role of the Bank of England, but I just wanted to start with the report that the Treasury released last week in accompanying the government's net zero strategy. This Treasury released this review paper, which basically reviewed what the costs of the net zero transition are going to be. And they essentially made this argument that borrowing to invest today for the climate challenge will incur an unfair burden on future generations. And I wanted to just dwell on this point because I actually think it's well, frankly, I think it's economically illiterate, and I think we need to really push back on these sorts of arguments because they're quite dangerous. As Frank said, and as those great charts pointed out, yields on long-term government debt are close to historic lows, and this is despite the fact that inflation is picking up. But an additional thing to bear in mind is that once you take into account inflation, yields on government debt are actually negative. That's because the rate of inflation is actually higher than the interest rate on government debt. So in real terms, investors are actually happy to pay for the privilege of holding UK government debt once inflation is accounted for. And then another dynamic to add to that is the fact that the UK government has started issuing what are known as green gilts, so government bonds where the proceeds are ring-fenced specifically for green projects. It's released two of them. What the most recent one was last month. They raised £10 billion from it. But the important point to note was that the appetite from investors was actually 10 times that amount. So £100 billion worth of investors' money was sitting on the sidelines, absolutely desperate to get into these green government bonds. So there's clearly a lot of appetite out there to support government spending for the green transition. Now, not taking the opportunity to lock into these highly favourable borrowing conditions today would actually be an enormous shirked opportunity in terms of investing in a way that is least likely to incur a large burden on future generations. Firstly, because as we all know, the costs of inaction are far greater than any debt burden that we need to take on today. But secondly, and this is speaking in pure economic terms, the most sensible way to actually manage public finances at the current juncture is not fiscal consolidation, but ensuring that whatever you're investing in is going to lead to output growth. Now, there's obviously lots of good reasons why we shouldn't focus on GDP growth as the be-all and end-all of progress, but in pure, simple economic terms, output growth actually erodes the real value of future debt payments. It lowers that future debt burden. So the key question here is not what the UK can afford to spend, but where such investment spending is strategically directed. And obviously green projects generate a lot of jobs, they generate huge economic activity and regeneration all over the country, or they have the potential to. So that's really what we should be speaking about here instead of affordability. Now, turning to the role of central banks, as Frank said, there's a very good reason that yields are at historic lows at the moment, because the Bank of England has effectively printed new money and used it to purchase all of the newly issued, or most of the newly issued government debt over the past few years in quantitative easing programmes. Now, I'll get onto the mechanics of how we can sort of adapt these policies more to support the Green New Deal in a second. But first of all, just for those of you who might not be aware, I think it's worth doing a quick 101 on what central banks actually are and, you know, what we can expect them to do for us. So essentially, they are public institutions that operate independently from the government, but they are tasked with keeping inflation low and stable. And traditionally, they've done this by changing interest rates to control the levels of demand in the economy. But since the financial crisis, central banks' roles, and in particular the Bank of England's role, has actually expanded quite significantly. It now is the supervisor and regulator of the banking system. It has what's known as a lender of last resort function to the financial system, which basically means it protects our payment system. And it's also expanded into ever more unconventional tools. Quantitative easing is one of them, but other programs it does, which are less well known about, is it also prints new money to buy corporate bonds, i.e., you know, the debt issued by companies. And since the pandemic, the Bank of England has also been lending directly to non-financial companies themselves. And in political economy terms, actually, the Bank of England has done a lot of the heavy lifting of macroeconomic policy making over the past 10 years, in a large part because the political mood has been against using fiscal expansion to boost demand in our economy. But really, that the limits of their firepower there are, you know, they're really reaching their limits now. We now need the fiscal side to take more of the burden in terms of directing our economy for the future, and particularly when it comes to the green transition. However, the Bank of England is still critical for climate change. At the moment, they have been very concerned about climate change, but only from the very specific perspective. So they're worried about it in terms of how climate change presents risks to the financial system. What they've been more hesitant to do is to go further and explore how they can use their policy toolkits to actively support the reallocation of capital flows in alignment with the government's net zero target. So it's very much the focus of climate change will impact the financial system, but not how is the financial system impacting climate change, if that makes sense. And I think there are two reasons this kind of risk-focused perspective is not going to be effective for climate change. Firstly, it may actually come into conflict with some climate goals. So if we consider, for example, that many countries and regions actually face a lot of physical risks from extreme weather events and other impacts of climate change, under the risk-based logic that the Bank of England is prioritising at the moment, financial institutions shouldn't really be in the business of providing finance to these areas because it may pose risks to the financial system. This is obviously not what we need in terms of funding for climate adaptation and for other urgently needed parts of the world which actually really need finance in order to manage the risks of climate change. The second reason I don't think this risk-based logic works is because the financial system actually, to a certain extent, is exacerbating the causes of climate change. We know for a fact that banks are continuing to fund fossil fuel expansion and deforestation and a lot of the corporate activities that are directly leading to this problem. So whilst the financial system is continuing to do this, they are actually actively contributing to the emergence of financial risk. So arguably the most logical way for the bank to actually manage financial risks is to guide where capital is actually going and to resolve that and ensure it aligns with a Green New Deal or with the government's legally mandated net zero emissions target. So what can the Bank of England actually do? Well, two things. Firstly, as Frank was saying, it can continue to create fiscal space for the government to borrow today for the future for a Green New Deal. And secondly, it can regulate the private financial system in order to ensure that it is aligned with the government's decarbonisation priorities. So taking both of those in turn, but for the first one, there's this idea of using quantitative easing for green purposes. Now, it's important to note that this might sound like a brand shiny new idea, but actually, historically, fiscal policy and monetary policy were much more strategically coordinated in order to create fiscal space for ambitious industrial strategy. So this has happened all over the world. It's happened in East Asian economies, but it actually also used to happen in Europe as well, in France and in Britain in the post-war era. It's a fact of central banking that's often forgotten, but there is precedent for this. And arguably, as Frank was saying, this sort of fiscal monetary coordination needs to continue in order to maintain the favourable borrowing conditions that we currently have in order to help fund borrowing that's needed for a Green New Deal. And there are a few ways the bank could do this. It could target the level of interest rates on government debt in order to ensure that those borrowing costs and interest payments stay low. It could commit to holding government debt issued for the purpose of a Green New Deal on its balance sheet permanently, which would effectively write off the debt completely. It can make commitments to continuing QE through the government's new green gilt issuance, which are specifically designed to fund green projects only. So there are a number of tools available there. And in terms of the second element, aligning the private financial system, really, this is mission critical. The government has actually recognised this in its net zero strategy, the fact that private finance needs to support and not undermine the government's decarbonisation policy priorities. What they haven't come up with is actually kind of clarity on how exactly they're going to ensure this alignment happens. But the Bank of England actually has a number of tools at its disposal here. Firstly, it can provide subsidised loans to banks that incentivise them to lend to green projects. It's done this already in an initiative called the Term Funding Scheme, which targeted lending to SMEs. And one argument is that this sort of programme should be reoriented for urgently required green projects, such as finance for housing retrofits, which households face huge upfront costs kind of retrofitting their homes. Also for the building of energy efficient homes and energy efficient mortgages. Secondly, the Bank of England can use its financial regulation toolkit to disincentivise funding to harmful activities which need to stop in order to meet net zero requirements. There's one tool it has called capital requirements, which are effectively charges that are levied on banks when they lend to risky projects. And given the massive risks obviously involved in continuing to fund climate breakdown, there's a strong argument that this sort of policy also needs to be applied to fossil fuel financing, for example. And actually, interesting today, the Bank of England has announced that it's going to start looking into this sort of policy, which is a great step forward. So I'll just wrap up with some quick thoughts. A lot of the hesitancy the Bank of England has had so far has been to do with the political economy of central bank independence, the fact that they have to operate at arm's length from the government to prevent, supposed undue political influence, etc. But, I think at this juncture, we have to ask ourselves, to what extent is the very rigid interpretation of central bank independence still fit for purpose when we're facing this very urgent task of accelerating a structural transition for our economy? And more broadly, I think it's often forgotten that the Bank of England has actually been given a new mandate to support government policy on the green transition. So they have the remit in order to undertake a lot of these projects. What we now need is citizen support to get behind it and start calling for these sorts of policies. So I'll just end it there. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Katie. I thought, really interesting that they have the remit, but they don't seem to have the logics that fit within that remit built into their system, like what you were saying about how they can't invest in the places that might need to because of risk strategy planning that they've got embedded. I think those are some of the contradictions that I think hopefully our next speaker Laurie will be able to talk to, some of the kind of political contradictions that we're facing and maybe some of the offers and opportunities that come out of it and what we should be fighting for. So Laurie, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks very much. And yeah, firstly, thanks very much for having me. It's great to join this discussion. So firstly, I mean, I think Frank and Katie have set out the sort of big picture context on the question of, why we need a Green New Deal and how to pay for it really well. The bottom line is that for a country like the UK, we absolutely can afford to pay for, to fund an ambitious Green New Deal if we choose to, and if we use our fiscal and monetary policy sensibly and don't allow ourselves to be strangled by the curse of austerity economics. One thing I'll just reinforce briefly before we go on to talk about other things is that Katie already alluded to this, but I think when it comes to talking about whether we can afford it, we really need to be comparing this to the cost of not acting. So what's the cost if we don't do this? And there's now a wealth of evidence that shows that the cost of not acting right now far outweighs whatever the cost of a Green New Deal is in terms of adapting to a world with higher temperatures or extreme weather events and all the rest of it. And that the longer that we wait to act, the higher that cost will be. And the government's own body, the Office for Budget Responsibility, came out with a paper earlier this year, which was very clear about this. And so the government really has no excuse for delaying action. But I want to mainly focus on some other aspects beyond fiscal and monetary policy, the kind of things that Katie and Frank were talking about, which I think need to also be part of the discussion. And the first thing is really that while clearly a Green New Deal needs lots of new spending, we need to be injecting lots of money into the economy and investing in lots of things. We also need to be looking at the money that we're already spending, that government's already spending. So the UK government currently provides about £10 billion a year of subsidies to the fossil fuel sector, which is far more than it spends on renewable energy. We currently have plans to invest in massive expansion in roads and airports and things like that, which clearly absolutely aren't compatible with the UK's climate goals. And so this money needs to be redirected into things that are going to help with the green transition, things like renewable energy, public transport, all that kind of stuff. Secondly, I think we need to make sure that the institutions, the public institutions that we already have as part of our public sector are all acting to accelerate the green transition rather than undermining it, which in some cases is already happening. And I think this is particularly important when it comes to finance. So we've already heard about central banks and central banking, but if we look at finance more broadly, as NEF and many others have been pointing out for many years, the broader financial sector in the UK today is much more part of the problem when it comes to climate change than it is part of the solution. Some of our big banks are among the biggest fossil fuel financiers in the world. Since the Paris Agreement was signed, UK banks have financed over £200 billion of fossil fuel projects. And clearly part of the answer here is about stronger regulation, is about reining in the private financial sector so that it stops being part of the problem and becomes part of the solution. But we also need to look at our own public institutions. So the UK today has now a relatively well-established public financial ecosystem. We have the British Business Bank, we now have the UK Infrastructure Bank operating domestically. We also have UK Export Finance and the CDC Group, which operate internationally. And taken together, these have, they're not insignificant, they have relatively significant financial power. But at the moment, they're really not pulling their weight. And in some cases, they're actually undermining the case by financing things like fossil fuel projects. And I actually recently co-authored a paper for NEF called Greening Public Finance, which outlined a number of changes to these institutions to basically mean that, to help them become part of that bold, ambitious Green New Deal for the UK. And I'd probably find that on the NEF website if anyone's interested. The next thing I think we should talk about is tax. And this has been touched on a little bit, but I think it's really important in the context of a Green New Deal, not just simply in a funding sense, but also in a distributional sense. So in the sense of, who gets what and why. Because we know when it comes to emissions, not everyone is contributing equally when it comes to using up the world or the UK's carbon budget. So we know for a fact that the richest 10% of the world's population has been responsible for over half of the cumulative emissions the world has seen between 1990 and 2015. And we look at the per capita consumption, so what individuals within different groups are contributing to that. The top richest 10% has contributed about 30 times higher than that of the poorest 50% of the world's population. And when you look at the top 1%, it's about 100 times higher. And so to the extent that climate breakdown and climate change is a result of unsustainable consumption patterns, it really is the consumption of the very wealthy here that's the problem, not most of the world's population. And this is obviously a result of a very unequal economic system. And so when we come to look at solutions, we need to be looking at reducing emissions and tackling inequality hand in hand, because that's going to be absolutely vital. And so that does mean things like higher taxes, particularly on things like wealth, to reduce inequality. It also means using the tax system more smartly, basically more wisely, so that we're, incentivizing things that are actually environmentally useful and making things that are environmentally harmful much more expensive. And in some senses, this is the kind of polar opposite of what we're doing at the moment, and that obviously needs to change. And taxes is an effective means of redistributing after the fact, so ex post. But we also need to be looking at the structure of our economy to begin with, and particularly things like ownership, partly because ownership is a key driver of inequality when we have highly unequal patterns of ownership and highly concentrated patterns of ownership, but also because we have today, if we look across the UK economy, there are many strategically important parts of our economy that are going to be crucially important in a transformational Green New Deal that will be difficult to do under the current patterns of that concentrated private ownership. So this includes things like energy, transport, things like that. It also includes though things like land. And so if we're going to meet our climate commitments, it's very clear, the Committee on Climate Change and various others are very clear on this, a sizable area of the UK's land is going to need to change use. We're going to need to do much more tree planting, peat restoration, rewilding, all this kind of stuff. But much of the land that's currently useful for this or currently suitable for this is basically in private hands, often managed as part of private estates and isn't being used sustainably. And so if we're going to actually meet our climate commitments, we really do need to be talking about things like land ownership, particularly where we have landowners that are resistant or not willing to invest in the kind of change that's needed. And just finally, I think we do need to be honest and open about the fact that there are basically large parts of our economy today that have no place on a sustainable planet. There are sectors, there are parts of our economy that really do effectively need to be dismantled quite quickly. And this shouldn't be a controversial idea. I mean, if you look throughout history, there'll be many, many cases where we as a society have decided that certain markets, certain parts of our economy are no longer compatible with our moral values and they've been outlawed. Look at things like slavery and child labor and things like that. And I do think that we do need to be taking the same approach today to things like fossil fuel extraction, to unsustainable agriculture, also things like, frankly, SUVs, private jets, things like that, which clearly really have no place on a sustainable planet. And we've got really no chance of meeting our climate goals as a global society as long as these things continue. And I think the final thing I'll finish on is that this basically highlights the real issue here, which I think a Green New Deal really isn't a technical problem, although there are lots of technical aspects of how we deliver a Green New Deal, some of which we've heard of tonight. We know what needs to be done. We have the technological and the financial means to do it, if we so choose to do it. It's mainly a political problem today because there are large numbers of very powerful interests that have very deep pockets, often very politically well connected, who don't want this to happen because they're doing very well out of the status quo. And so I think the real question or the real challenge that really we should all be thinking about, for those of us who care about the future of the planet anyway, is how do we build and organize enough power, both on the ground and through the democratic process, to challenge these interests and put our economy on a radically different path? Because if we can't do that, then unfortunately we will fail, even if we have all of the best policy ideas and all the best policy papers in the world. And so, yeah, I'll end there. Thank you.
Amazing, Laurie. And as an organizer, music to my ears to hear that from an economist. Before I move on to the next speaker, I do just want to take a second to plug the New Economics Foundation Supporters Network. I know many of you on this call will be part of it, but you can join the Supporters Network from as little as £3 a month. Supporters donations help fund our work, including running events like this, and allow us to plan further ahead into the future. So if you're an F supporter on this call, then thank you so much for all your support. And if not, then check out the link that we'll be posting in the chat now. And towards the end of this event, I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of those campaigning and organising actions that NEF are doing around a Green New Deal. So stay tuned for that. Now I want to pass it on to our final speaker, Sara. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks also a lot for the great presentations by Frank, Katie and Laurie. I hope I can contribute about the European perspective. I was going to say it's a bugger for you that you're missing out on the super interesting debate that's taking place in the EU now about the EU fiscal framework. But hearing your talks, I think the similarities are much larger than the differences. And so is the problem analysis. And so are actually the solutions, but you'll hear more about that in my talk. So I'm Sara. I work for the Sustainable Finance Lab, a think tank based in the Netherlands. We're bridging theory and practice, and we're very much on top of policy issues such as, for example, the EU fiscal framework. So my main takeaway of today, my main message is that a more progressive EU fiscal framework is needed to deliver on the European Green Deal, because I'll be focusing on the European Green Deal. And I also think the outcome of the debate about the EU fiscal framework is crucial for financing the Green Deal and achieving its goals. Now, there's of course a lot to be said about the European Green Deal and whether it's enough or not. A lot of criticism is coming from environmentalists, and I of course agree with that, but I cannot unfortunately say much about that. I will say something briefly about the Green Deal as it stands now. So its main goal is a reduction of 55% in carbon emissions by 2030, compared with 1990 levels. And the European Commission has calculated that it needs more or less 1,000 billion or 1 trillion euros to be spent in the next 10 years. It's quite some money. This money will be taken from the EU budget, from EU funds, also new funds, current, existing, and also new EU programs. But it's also very dependent on big investments made by both the private and the public sector. And that's quite problematic because we have currently also a green transformation funding gap, just a green funding gap, including all brownfield projects that are also needed to actually make the necessary steps towards the green energy transition of 470 billion per year. That's a lot. And on top of this, also McKinsey of all institutions has said that 60% of the necessary investments to be done before 2030 to actually transition to a net zero Europe do not have a viable business case. I think this number alone already says that we cannot rely on the private sector itself to realize the goals of the Green Deal and also of Paris and everything that needs to be done to do something about the climate state emergency, but more public investments are needed. And this is, of course, where fiscal rules comes in. So fiscal rules are often masked as a technical debate, as well as monetary policy, which Katie brilliantly explained, I think. But in fact, as with all technical issues, they're very political. That's also, of course, what Laurie said in his final notes. And these fiscal rules are about the budget space, so the expenditure and investments that governments have to steer economies in a certain direction. They're also very fundamental for the transition towards the green economy. And the European Commission knows about this. So Gentiloni, EU Commissioner, when he was referring to the debate about the EU fiscal rules that's taking place in the EU now, said that there is pressing need to support growth and in particular to mobilize the immense investments required to tackle climate change. End of quote. So EU fiscal rules are really necessary to make the necessary steps, and they're very stringent now. I will come to that in a second. I think also interesting to notice is that if you look at the goals of the EU, you have their sustainable development, social progress, but also environmental protection. And I think in the European debate about the future of the fiscal framework, referring to these European goals is also important because it actually includes environmental protection. So what's the problem now in the EU? As in the UK, we have very strict fiscal rules. The norms for the deficit and the debt, that's a threshold of 3% of your deficit, GDP, and then 60% public debt. And they hinder countries to make necessary expenditures and investments, both to get their economies out of the COVID crisis. This goes especially for Southern European countries, but actually also for example, my own country, the Netherlands, but also, of course, to make the steps towards the green energy transition. So here the main takeaway is that we need more fiscal space to unlock unnecessary public investments to get out of COVID and also to move towards a sustainable green future. Now, the political state of play in the EU provides us with some opportunities because these strict rules are now cancelled or postponed due to COVID, so that governments can actually invest themselves out of the crisis until 2023. Of course, the problem is those strict rules will be perhaps reinstated again unless we change them, and this will mean that there is going to be a lot of new austerity. Of course, we should learn from the past, and I think also the EU is very keen on not making exactly the same mistakes as we did during the EU crisis, the Euro crisis. But still, also in the Netherlands, already it's talk of the town that, you know, this cannot go on forever. There's no rules. We also need to go back to the rules, and also austerity is part of that debate. Now, about the EU fiscal policy debate, European Commission has launched a consultation about the fiscal framework, about the economic governance. and everyone can take part. So a Sustainable Finance Lab and also our partners in our Fiscal Matters Coalition will take part in that. So there's going to be a lot of input delivered on making the necessary steps towards a more progressive fiscal framework. That's one thing that gives us opportunities. The other one is that the EU has established a recovery fund of 750 billion during the COVID crisis. It consists of both loans and subsidies. And those are mainly targeted to finance the green energy transition. And of course, you all spoke also about the low interest rates surrounding and that the servicing costs of debt are very low at this moment. So this also gives us opportunities to invest more than we would do under different circumstances. So when it comes to new proposals or reforming the current strict fiscal rules, what are the most interesting and perhaps also most viable proposals on the table? Well, we have the Stability and Growth Pact, which contains these 60% and 3% debt and deficit norms. You could think of making those rules more flexible. For example, country-specific rules, because one size doesn't fit all, but also to think of a slower pace of debt reduction. Another interesting proposal, I think, is the Green Golden Rule, which exempts specific green investments, which will not be calculated in your deficit. So it provides countries with a specific space to make steps regarding the green energy transition. Another more controversial one, a very sensitive one also in the Netherlands, is making this EU recovery fund more permanent because it's only a temporary fund. Everything in the EU, as you probably know, it's always temporary until it becomes permanent. And this often happens in times of crisis. So there's a lot of thinking about, well, perhaps we should have such a fund for a more permanent goal, also to make sure that there's more transfers from the north to the south, because we need more convergence. The EU is actually diverging instead of converging. And then last but not least, of course, the bigger narrative is, where do we want to go with fiscal union? Do we want a fiscal capacity? Do we want Eurobonds, which is common debt issuance? And that's the most sensitive, of course, topic, which will not be discussed. So all commissioners saying, no, this is not part of the consultation. We will discuss about this later. But actually, I think it's a big elephant in the room. Which future for the fiscal union? So main takeaway for today, again, I hope I've convinced you that a more progressive EU fiscal framework, which is very political and not only technical, is necessary to deliver on the Green Deal. We need to unlock those public investments, and also think that the outcome of the debate about the EU's fiscal future is crucial for financing this deal. And I'll make sure to also share the link of the consultation, because everyone can take part, including yourself.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sara. We're now going to go to questions, and we've been kind of recording a lot of the questions that have come in. I am going to I'll probably ask a kind of round first of questions to the panel, and then you can kind of go amongst yourselves. Try and keep it kind of short so that we can get as many questions in as possible, because we got a lot of them. So the first question I'm going to ask is from Anne. And Anne has said, and this is kind of directed at you, Frank. So thanks, Frank. I think I may have missed something, but could you clarify what the problem is? I got that borrowing is high, but interest rates are low. How is this a problem? Is the government keen to keep interest rates low and hence discouraging borrowing and investment in green strategies? And then I'll ask another bunch of questions, but we'll cover them all. So this is a broader question, which is, why do we think the government doesn't want to borrow? What are some of the limits on government borrowing if the Bank of England can print money? And I'll leave it at that for now, so for the first round. So Frank, do you want to start, and then we'll go around?
Cool. Can I just check that you can hear me better now? If I'm closer to the camera. Great. So I apologize if my presentation came off as inaccessible at times. It's difficult sometimes to know your audience, as well as kind of take the macroeconomic hat off of when you're on the budget and analysis. So I apologize for that. In fact, what I was basically trying to say is that in 5 years' time, our economy is going to be much smaller than it can be. That people's wages are going to be lower than they could be. And that we're not going to have enough investment in the environment than we can afford. And as Laurie actually quite rightly pointed out, not making those investments now is going to be more costly in the future. Actually, the OBR's figure is that they're going to double the cost in 10 years if you don't make those investments. now. And what's the other interesting point to really say is that these investments will effectively pay for themselves. Because the interest rate is so low, that is the cost to borrow right now is so low that you make these investments now, the returns that will, and the benefits to society over time will effectively pay for themselves. So that's a key message that maybe I forgot to mention. The second thing that I just wanted to highlight is that the borrowing of the government, when we borrow, it's not necessarily that it's my point exactly that it's too low right now. And if we want to bring the economy, the wages, and to prevent that economic scarring, to prevent the economy from being smaller than it was, and to invest in climate, we can afford to borrow a lot more actually than we tend not to, than is currently conventionally thought. And the reason why I think there's a political game that's happening, and it's not, and these, announcing these low borrowing levels might seem like good politics, but it's definitely bad economics, and it's bad for the planet too. And unless we start making these types of investments that we can afford now, we'll be in a much worse situation 5 years from now. I think Katie can talk a bit more about the constraints around the printing of money side of things too.
Great. Yeah, Katie, do you want to follow on the second questions?
Yeah, sure. You're right, there are limitations to how much debt the government can issue, even if the Bank of England is stepping in as a permanent buyer of government bonds. Firstly, the investors, who are pension funds, insurance companies, wealth management companies, who also invest in government bonds, can lose confidence if there is too much debt issuance, and they can, do mass fire sales of government debt, which leads to high interest rates and all sorts of problems. Secondly, if government debt is not spent wisely, i.e. if it's spent in a way that boosts the demand side of the economy without also expanding the supply side, there is a risk it could lead to inflation. However, the two big caveats to these risks are the fact that none of this is a given. It all depends on where, what the funds that are used for, whether it's for just spending that's gone or whether it's for investment that actually reaps rewards further down the line. Now, the interesting thing about green public investment spending is it has been estimated by a lot of academics to have much larger economic multiplier effects than conventional fiscal investment. Now, what this means is that this kind of public investment will create more jobs, it will generate more economic activity, and in a way that is better distributed across the entire country than the conventional sort of fiscal stimulus programs. So to give you one example, green retrofitting, for example, fixing our cold and leaky homes. These sorts of projects are not only urgently needed for our decarbonisation challenge, but they also have high economic multiplier effects because a lot of them are very close to being shovel ready. They're almost good to go. We just need to train up our labour force. They're very labour intensive jobs, which means they generate additional employment, and that employment is very well distributed across the UK. And also the training and upskilling that's required is going to boost the UK's productivity levels. So in that sense, this sort of public investment spending actually has really big unrealised synergies with the government's own levelling up agenda. So it's not a question of how much debt we can afford to take on, it's how the government chooses to invest that debt, and we need to get them to do it wisely. And obviously the most urgent challenge at the moment is the ecological transition.
Fantastic. Laurie, I might come to you on the question of, why do we think the government doesn't want to borrow? The kind of political question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a good question. I think there are a number of things here. I mean, one thing, firstly, frankly, is ideology. And clearly both, we have a Conservative government, and obviously that party brings with it a certain ideology, but also particularly within the Treasury itself, which obviously isn't a party political institution, it's the sort of key organ of the British state. The Treasury and the sort of culture and the mindset within the Treasury has, for a very, very long time, been a very, very small c Conservative institution, particularly when it comes to the public finances. there's a thing called the Treasury view, which is, notorious for basically being very, very, focusing on being prudent and, reining in public spending and that kind of thing. It's deeply, deeply ingrained in that institution, and it goes back, a very, very long time. And I think that is very, very difficult to change. It's very, very difficult to change quickly. And there's an instinctive skepticism of big spending or big borrowing within the Treasury. And obviously the reality with the way the UK government works is nothing can happen unless it gets signed off from the Treasury. It's a very, very, very powerful institution. And so, it holds vast amounts of power. And until that changes, I think we're going to face this challenge. And the second thing, I think it comes back to this political economy point that I talked about before, which is obviously, we might all sitting here think this is a no-brainer, why we're not doing this. There's a lot of very powerful interests out there who definitely don't want this to happen, not just government spending, but more generally the sort of Green New Deal type approach that we're all talking about here, because they're doing very well from the status quo and they see that threatens their financial interests. And so there's a lot of power orbiting around the government and the governing party. And you can see this if you just take the time, like some of my colleagues at Open Democracy have done, trolling through the donations to some of our governing parties that are really, putting quite a lot of time and effort into stopping this kind of program from happening. And so, yeah, I would say it comes basically down to ideology on the one hand and power on the other.
Fantastic. That leads on to the final question, which I'm going to ask, which is, it seems like we have the ideas for how to pay for a Green New Deal, but how do we build the power we need to challenge those vested interests that you're talking about, the ones that are standing in the way? Like, how do we build enough power to tackle the climate change and challenge those interests? I guess it'd be interesting to hear, Sara, from you on the kind of Europe, what's happening in Europe, and then maybe each of you could talk about, Frank, you're having insider track conversations around how we can appeal to the logics of certain organizations. I imagine, Laurie, you're doing it from a more sort of like activist base, and it'd be interesting, Katie, to hear from you. So if you could kind of wrap up in a kind of, where do we go from here? How do we fight the fight?
Yeah, so from a European perspective, I mean, I think every European has sort of a love-hate relationship with the EU, right? Because there's many problems. There's a lot of austerity, neoliberalism. I think there's a lot of intransparency, but also a lot of governments are very neoliberal. There's a lot of divide and conquer, in the sense that in the Netherlands, for example, which is a very frugal country, there's very much this narrative about the Southern European countries, which goes, they're lazy, they don't do much, we don't want to pay for their problems. If they screw up their own economy, it's up to them to pay, right? So this is very, I think, toxic rhetoric. The way to tackle that, I think, is to show that we all benefit from a prosperous EU. And that's also why I always point to the EU goals, because I don't think anyone actually realizes that what the EU is doing now, and also the way it has handled, for example, the euro crisis, is actually dividing countries and also contributing to divergence. I do think the European Commission is taking good steps. I also think the ECB actually has learned from the former crisis. I'm also curious to find out what Katie thinks of that. But I think there's much more coordination now between fiscal and monetary policy, or at least there's the effort that this needs to be done. When it comes to more solidarity between countries, I also think it's a matter of myth debunking. So what we're doing here also in the Netherlands, the Sustainable Finance Lab, is showing that the EU is very profitable for the Dutch, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of stability, in terms of being in a union together and trying to negotiate for better deals regarding European public goods and things that matter to us all. And that also means that we need to tackle all the prejudices that we have against the southern countries. We can do this, I think, by narratives, by activism, also by just showing the blunt facts sometimes, because I think a lot of prejudices are not well founded, and it's just up to us, I think, to dismantle them. So I think also activism, I'm also an activist, is really key when it comes to technical issues like these. And that's also why we're trying to get more climate activists on board regarding this project, because I think climate activists not always realize that these fiscal rules are very important also for their goals and their ideals. So it's also, I think that's also what's nice, I think, about a crisis. Never waste a crisis, of course. It's time to show that problems are interrelated, and that the solutions can go hand in hand. And I think we've seen that in the Netherlands and throughout the world with, for example, environmental problems and Black Lives Matter. But I think we should now also go to the more fiscal and technical matters, and to unite on that front as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to ask for 90 seconds from the rest of you because we're getting close to time. So Frank, do you want to go next, then Katie, and then Laurie?
Sure. So my response basically is very, very simple, actually. Both the UK and in Europe, post 2008, what we as a collective, as civil society, as people, there was less of kind of a movement demanding what we wanted. There was less of an open debate around, how the direction of the economy we wanted. And as Laurie said, actually, most of these things are man-made. Like, we can design the economy the way we want to. And so what we have to get right over the next 5 years is to build that movement and have a collective campaign. We need to make sure that decisions that affect our everyday lives don't happen behind closed doors and that they don't move too technical. I'm guilty of that today. Discussions that are brought to the fore and that people feel like they have agency in these types of things. And part of that is by building that movement, but it's also part of making sure that we have devolution that happens in terms of decision making. And so I'll stop there, but I think it's really, the emphasis needs to be on building that movement from the ground up, and making sure that we start with the people that are affected with policy at the beginning as an end user.
Brilliant. Thanks, Frank. Katie, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said so far. I'll add a slightly different perspective. I think one area where our movement really needs to grow and develop more is kind of getting our arguments, many of the arguments we've made today actually on this panel, more into the mainstream media. I don't know if you guys saw Andrew Marr last week, kind of debunking the net zero, government's net zero strategy, but it was very disappointing the way he was framing a lot of the arguments in terms of climate change being the transition being a cost centre, and not even once mentioning the very significant economic benefits that are going to result from having a Green New Deal. So yeah, I think, and that is reflected in the prevailing attitude by the general public in terms of the cost of the transition. This is really hard-hitting stuff. These attitudes really need to change if we're going to get the broader public and the broader political spectrum on board with what we're asking.
Fantastic. Laurie?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with everything that's been said so far, and this really is the kind of million-dollar question. And I think just to add to that, I mean, there is some optimism here in the sense that if you look at a lot of the polling that's been done, certainly in the UK and elsewhere, climate is now one of the most, people's top concerns, which is a good thing. And there was a study recently by the UN which had the UK as the country with the highest level of public concern about climate. And obviously we've seen polls on things like support for Green New Deal actually being there. So the question is, how do we translate that into action? And I think part of that is about that sort of grassroots on the ground organising that Frank talked about. We've seen, again, cause for optimism in recent years, the school strikers, the Friday for Future stuff, all of that, much more of that building over time, applying pressure from the below up. But then crucially also in the democratic process. I mean, certainly in the UK, young people, which showed the most concern for these issues by far, repeatedly aren't turning out when it comes to the crunch at elections and things like that. And as a result, we're getting governments that are mainly elected by, the part of the electorate that are over 50. And so connecting again with that political engagement into the democratic process, I think there's no way that this is going to happen without that. And so that's another area which I think we really, really do need to try and build much more strength and power and organising over the years ahead, because without that, we aren't going to be able to achieve anything.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, I want to thank Katie because throughout you raised the issue of retrofit. I'm an organiser at NEF, and some of you, if you're supporters, might be aware that NEF, on this explicit issue about how do we try and tangibly come up with practical solutions that activists can organise around, are organising a campaign called the Great Homes Upgrade, which is about retrofit and the benefits of retrofit and how we can push for a public demand for it and lobby our councillors, our local authorities, our MPs to demand this as a national mission, because it, like Katie said, the multiplier effect is massive. It's 4 times many other kind of infrastructure spending, which has less benefits to people's health and the environment. So if you're interested in that, that is the kind of practical campaigning action-based stuff that NEF is doing alongside its really sort of detailed analysis of what some of the symptoms of these problems are, and the kind of structural problems that are facing our economy. So I've just put a link to that campaign in the chat. I want to thank you all again for coming, because for me, as an organizer, it's really important to understand the structures that we're fighting against, so that we can, politically educate the people that want to transform Britain. Like Laurie said, we have the popular support is behind stopping climate change. Like, there's popular support behind retrofit. There's popular support around green transitions. It's all being framed as a cost, and actually we need to frame it as an opportunity for people. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope you got as much out of it as I did, and have a great evening, everyone.